This past weekend, I was able to virtually cover FrightFest 2024 for the first time ever. For those of you that don't live in England and don't know what FrightFest is basically one of the UK's biggest horror film festivals, and this year it celebrated its 25th anniversary. Like I just said, this was my first time covering the festival in any capacity, and I really appreciate the festival for allowing me to cover the lineup through online screeners, which was a real godsend this year because I was able to see 11 films in total from the lineup. Unfortunately, I couldn't see some of the bigger films in the lineup, such as Chris Stuckman's Shelby Oaks, which I was really gutted about. But that being said, I still was able to see 11 films from the lineup, ranging in quality. So without any further ado, this is everything that I watched at FrightFest 2024. So the first film I watched is a bit of an interesting one because technically this film came out everywhere else last year, and for some reason the UK was the one country that didn't get it, and that still baffles me to this day. But as soon as I saw that this film was on the FrightFest lineup, I made it my priority to see it first, and that is The Last Voyage of the Demeter. After seeing the film, I honestly don't know why we didn't get it last year because this film was really good. I think my favourite aspect of the film is that it absolutely nails the gothic horror aesthetic and vibe that it is going for, and I think that is strengthened, one, because of its visuals, and two, because of the fantastic performances across the board in this movie. From the way this film looks to the characters in it, everything about this film looks and sounds like it is era appropriate, and that attention to detail in all of those aspects really pays off. I think one of my only criticisms with the film is that it kind of lasts about 5 minutes too long, but outside of that I really enjoyed what this film had to offer, and I personally think if the performances across the board weren't as strong as they were, then I think this film would have fallen flat on its face. The second film I watched was a thriller called Dead Male, which I honestly didn't know much about. And you're going to hear me say that a lot about almost all the films going forward in this video. A lot of the films in the lineup I honestly had never heard of before and were going in completely blind to, which for some of these films really worked in their favour, but then there are other films where that kind of was to its detriment. But Dead Male is definitely one of those films where the less you know about it, the better going in, because I didn't know what to expect, and this film just kept surprising me the more it went on. Dead Male is one of those films where it kind of presents one thing but then turns into something completely different by the end, and I think that's what I loved about this film the most. It kept me on my toes, and just when I had an idea of where it was going, either in terms of its story or the specific aesthetic it's going for, it then just kind of flips that on its head and then tries something else and then carries on with that. And in some films that can be a detriment to the filmmaking, but here, by the time you reach the end of the movie, you can tell that everything that it was doing was purposeful, and it definitely pays off by the end. And it's actually sort of emotionally gratifying as well by the time you reach the end, which I was honestly not expecting about halfway through the movie. But for it to be as emotionally satisfying as it was, when the credits started rolling, honestly took me by surprise, and I mean that in the best way possible. The next film I watched was a psychological horror thriller called Broken Bird. Again, I didn't know anything about this film other than the fact that it was written by the guy who plays Paddy in Emmerdale, which is a weird bit of information, and do with that what you will. But again, this one thankfully surprised me. I don't think it blew me away as it has done for some other people, but I still really appreciated what this film had to offer. I think Joanne Mitchell's direction is superb in this film. It knows exactly what it is, and it's directed within an inch of its life. However, the standout thing in this film for me was Rebecca Calder in the lead role of Sybil. Everything she does with this character just works. Even during the moments that could be cringy or awkward, she completely sells them, and I think her performance, matched with Joanne Mitchell's direction, really sells the things that, if handled by anyone else, could have been a little bit awkward. I think one of my only criticisms with the film is that it sets up so many subplots that by the time you get to that crucial final act, it feels like it's rushing through everything and trying to wrap all of these different key points as quickly as it can, which, considering there's been so much build-up, can feel a little bit anticlimactic. The actual finale itself is very satisfying for the sake of the story, but there are certain things here and there where I was like, oh, okay, you're kind of brushing over this thing very quickly just so you can get to the next thing you want to kind of wrap up, which again works fine, but I just wish they'd kind of let that finale breathe a little bit so certain things could be wrapped up with a bit more cohesion. The next film I watched was a horror comedy called Members Club, which the best way I can describe this film is if you took the full Monty and mixed in elements of satanic rituals and witchcraft in it. I know that sounds bonkers and weird, but that's kind of what the film is. And I'm going to be honest, this one didn't work for me. And I'm going to be brutally honest, that pains me to say that because I am always a sucker for a really good horror comedy, but unfortunately Members Club kind of fails in both aspects. The horror elements are fine, but it's a million things you've seen before, and it really doesn't do anything new with those things and just kind of goes through the motions. But the humour, on the other hand, is something you're either going to love or you're going to hate. There were a few jokes near the start that did actually work for me, but as the film went on, it kind of just regurgitated that same sort of humour to the point where it just wasn't funny anymore. The next film I watched was a thriller called Cold Wallet. I honestly don't have much to say about this film, other than the fact that I think the performances are the best aspect of it, and the many twists and turns in which the story takes can be a little bit predictable at times, but I thought they were well executed for the most part. And I will admit, for a home invasion heist-style thriller like this, I think the character motivations of why they're doing what they're doing were really well justified, and I thought the film did a really good job of getting us to sympathise with the people that are doing this, whereas with some films it just seems like they're doing it just because, but here it really does feel like a last-ditch attempt, and you really do feel for these characters. Even if they do make some stupid decisions along the way, that motivation is the one thing that could make or break this type of film, and I think that aspect is really well handled. I also think the film is decently shot, as well as being, like I said, well acted, but the film just, again, similar to Members Club, goes through the motions of the things you would expect to see in this sort of film, and really doesn't give you anything more than that. After that, I then watched a horror comedy which was actually really good and was actually one of my favourites of the whole festival, and that was Scared Shitless. Yes, that is in fact the name of the film, I'm not making that up. This is a film about a plumber and his germophobic son as they attempt to get rid of this alien-like creature that is running around the pipes of an apartment block killing people off one by one. That is the premise of the film, and that's all you need to know going into this. And this film worked for me way more than I thought it was going to. I mean, just from the poster and the name of it, and even the tagline, I didn't think this was going to work for me, but it did. Because I think the main reason why it did work is because it just knows what it is. Unlike Members Club, where it just felt like it was, you know, doing the things you're supposed to do to tick all the boxes, Scared Shitless knows what it is, sticks to it, and commits to that. It doubles down on stuff like toilet humour and practical gory effects that both work for what they need to. Now, one of the biggest comparisons between this and Members Club is the fact that this is an actually funny film. I think, again, because the film knows what it is, it knows what type of humour it can get away with. If it wants to delve into toilet humour, it will. If it wants to present a joke that's actually well written and clever, it will also do that. And it finds the right moments to put these jokes in, rather than trying to just present really obvious jokes that you can see coming from a mile away. And again, because this film knows what it is and just sticks to it, it makes the horror elements just as more satisfying when they do pop up. After that, I then watched this drama called Charlotte, which, funnily enough, also stars one of the actors from Members Club. Again, similar to Cold Wallet, I don't really have much to say about this film, other than the fact that it felt a little bit out of place in a FrightFest lineup. All of the other films I saw up to this point, I could at least understand to an extent why they were here. For example, Cold Wallet, from some perspective, could be seen as a drama, but there is a heavy heist thriller element to it, and thrillers are kind of in line with horror or is adjacent to that. And again, Scared Shitless is a horror comedy. Members Club is a horror comedy. Last Voyage of the Demeter is a horror film. Charlotte has elements of thriller in there, but for about 99% of the film, it just feels like a drama, which is fine, and I'm happy to watch a drama, but when I'm expecting thrillers or horrors, this film kind of felt a little bit out of place. I think a lot of the ways in which this film tackles its very sensitive subject matter, I thought were for the most part very well handled. Then there are other parts where it can feel a little bit tone deaf, and it's just doing it for the sake of doing it. Plus, there are some story elements that just genuinely didn't work for me. This is mostly in the second half of the film. For the most part, the whole film, story-wise, is fine. It doesn't do anything amazing or anything groundbreaking. But it's when you get to that third act where it presents these things that could either make or break your personal perception of the film. For me, I thought those elements didn't necessarily work, and I thought it needed to be more confident in its execution to get away with things that it did. And unfortunately, because the film doesn't feel that confident with what it's doing, it felt like those elements kind of felt flat a little bit, at least for me personally. The next film I watched was this low-budget disaster film called Survive, which is about a family on a boat celebrating their son's birthday when the ocean suddenly decides to completely recede. At least I think that's what happens. The film doesn't do a good job of explaining what happened in terms of the natural world-ending disaster that occurs, but that's what I'm going to go with. So, Survive is an interesting one because it's not very good. It's a bit of an annoying one, this one, because the trailer and the poster looked very intriguing, and the core concept, again, is also very intriguing if handled very well. And this film isn't fully crap. It does have things going for it. I think visually the film looks the part. The cinematography is stunning, and the way that they use canyons in this film to kind of visually represent the bottom of the ocean after all the water's gone, I thought was a very simple but clever idea, and I think they do a very good job of having canyons double up for that. Plus, I think the visual effects in this film, for the most part, are pretty decent. There's a couple of points where they look a bit ropey, but again, considering the budget and the possible restraints of this film, I think they did a good job, and they are mostly convincing. However, where this film falls flat for me is in the story and in the characters. The two actors playing the parents in this film I thought were decent, and I thought they definitely carried the film with their performances. Some of them I've seen in other stuff before, so I know that they're good actors. It's the children of the family which is where this film falls apart, because the amount of stupid decisions that these two characters make, I honestly lost count with this film. Because with a film like this, especially in the disaster movie subgenre, you need to have characters that make somewhat clever decisions. The odd stupid decision here and there is fine, but every single decision that these two children make puts the family more in peril than they initially were, and any form of tension that the film tries to squeeze out of the scenarios are scenarios that the children put the family in the first place. Thankfully, I was able to cleanse the palate with by far the best thing I saw in the entire FrightFest lineup, and that is the thriller called Strange Darling. In terms of the story, I'm not going to say anything. This is a film that you need to go in as blind as possible with. Don't watch the trailer, don't look up the synopsis, just go into it as blind as possible, because that's how I experienced it, and that's why I loved it even more by the time it had finished. Similar in a sense to Scared Shitless, Strange Darling knows exactly what it is and just revels in playing around with the thriller genre. that it has set itself in. It does a lot of stuff that I was not expecting it to do, especially with the fact that it plays around with non-linear storytelling. I thought this was just going to be a very cut and paste, cat and mouse style thriller, and it is that for the most part. But once it introduces the non-linear aspect of its storytelling and starts playing around with expectations, which it does throughout the entire runtime, that's when it started to intrigue me even more. Thankfully, on top of that, you've got two incredible lead performances from Willa Fitzgerald and Kyle Gallner, who are both just incredible in this film. I can't stress how good they are in this movie. They work brilliantly off of each other, but when they both need to just switch the gears on and be either frightened or menacing, they both do incredible jobs at those respected things. The film also looks stunning. The film is shot entirely on 35mm film, so it gives this very pulpy, grindhouse aesthetic to it, which I think really works in the film's favour. And yeah, it's just a really good film, and you will not know where it is going to go the more it keeps going. The second to last thing that I watched was a adventure comedy called Bookworm, starring Elijah Wood. Again, similar to Charlotte, this felt a little bit out of place in the FrightFest lineup, but I gave it a go anyway. And this film honestly wasn't that bad. It feels like it's trying to be something it's not. It feels like it's trying to be another Taika Waititi style comedy, like Hunt for the Wilder People is probably the best example. There's a lot of elements to this film that feel like it's trying to do its own version of that, but not as good. I think the performances in this film are pretty decent, especially Elijah Wood, who I thought was really good in this film. When he needs to be dramatic and emotional, he is great. When he needs to be funnier, he also does a really good job in that aspect. And I also think he bounces really well off of the young main star of this film, Nell Fisher, who is going to be hit and miss for most people who watch this film. There are some points where she can be one of the most annoying characters you will have seen in a film for a long time, but then there are other points where she can be very endearing and likeable and quite charming. But yeah, she can be the one element of this film that can kind of make it or break it for you. For me, I thought she worked fine, but there were definitely some moments where I was like, God, you are actually getting on my nerves. And the final film that I watched from the FrightFest 2024 lineup was a sci-fi drama thriller called Things Will Be Different. Again, this was another one I went completely blind into, and I was pleasantly surprised by this one. Again, similar to Charlotte, it feels more like a drama than a lot of the other films that I watched during FrightFest. But for this film, I think it works because it focuses more on being a drama with thriller elements, and any sci-fi thing that is in the film is very subtle and is more of a background character that kind of pushes the story and characters along. I thought the two lead performances were fantastic. I think considering this film's budget, I thought the film looked stunning. And this really worked for me. I think if the dynamic between the brother and sister in this film hadn't been as strong as it was, I don't think it would have worked, but because the performances are just as good as they are, that's what makes this film work. And the whole sci-fi element of this film can get rather confusing towards the end, but if you're paying attention and start putting pieces together in your head, then a lot of it will definitely pay off for you as a viewer by the time you get to the end. I thought the way it kept amping up that whole sci-fi element in the background, I thought was really well done. It's almost like it is a drama for about like 80% of the film, but then when it needs to kind of elevate those sci-fi elements towards the back end of the film and start making the narrative just that bit more complex, it does so in a way that just feels coherent within the film that it's set up. So that is everything that I watched at FrightFest 2024. Unfortunately, like I said, I didn't get a chance to see some of the big films at the festival like The Substance or Shelby Oaks, but I'm happy with the ones that I have seen. And yeah, there were some really great films in there, like Scared Shitless and Strange Darling, which I highly recommend you watch when they become more widely available. If you attended FrightFest, or if you've seen any of the films that I've talked about in this video, then please let me know what you think about those films in the comments below, or even which ones you're excited to see going off of what I've spoken about them in this video. If you like the video, then give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Bye.